Welcome back to my Line of Departure channel. I'm Jim Werbinath. Today I'd like to talk about the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which was one of the key battles of the American Revolution in 1781. It was instrumental in setting up the eventual Franco-American victory at Yorktown, and it was one of those battles that results in a Pyrrhic victory. The British officially won. They retained control of the battlefield, but it was such a near-run thing and so costly for them, it was an American strategic victory. I've been to this battlefield a couple of times and just north of Greensboro, North Carolina, and I can highly recommend a visit. In fact, this presentation was done after visiting the battlefield and getting research advice from the volunteers and the staff at the Visitor Center, for which I am profoundly grateful. Also, too, I presented on this at Origins Game Fair in 2024, and I had an audience there of one. My general rule is that if anybody shows up, I proceed with the presentation. If anyone does not, if I'm the only one standing there, I'm not going to talk into empty air. But an audience of one, that was enough for me. At the same time, I put a lot of work into this, and I'd like to see it reach a few more people than the one very interested person who sat through it the first time. So without further ado, let's get on to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Nothing takes place in a vacuum, nor did this battle. And for context, I'd like to introduce the strategic situation in 1780. There was a general stalemate in the North in the American Revolution. The British were firmly entrenched at New York. They were hemmed in by West Point. And also, too, they had to redeploy troops to the Caribbean, especially after the French intervened after the Battle of Saratoga. And this did shift the balance of power. Prior to this, you could say that the balance of power had been in Britain's favor. France comes in, and eventually Spain and the Netherlands. Britain ends up being on the back foot, and a little desperate, perhaps, to break the stalemate. Also, to remember, the Americans had no chance of invading Britain or any of its very lucrative Caribbean colonies, but the French certainly could, especially they combined forces with the Spanish. And the Royal Navy at this point was the chief defender of the British Isles, but it was not at the high point of its capabilities. My view, the Royal Navy was getting kind of smug. They were more interested in how ships looked and polishing the brass than they were interested in preparing for battle, preparing for war. The French were hungry. They were spending lots of money to increase the size of their fleet. They were expanding their forces in part for revenge after their loss in the 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War, but it was actually a global conflict that cost France dearly. But they were in a position at this point that it was not beyond the realm of possibility that the French could invade Britain. And hence, this is why Britain was always looking over its shoulder. And at this point, too, they were withdrawing substantial land forces from North America to defend the West Indies and also to attack the French there. Also, too, Washington's army stationed in the North was stronger than it had been. It had had time to recover after Valley Forge, the defeat in New York City, and the surprisingly well-fought battle at Monmouth. The quality had improved as well. They had French aid, better weapons, and also the influence of Friedrich von Steuben and his application of a simplified Prussian drill. We should remember, too, that Steuben was unemployable in Europe. He was not a von, he was middle class, and this did not go over well with the Prussian army. They had commissioned middle class officers when they started running out of so-called gentlemen of the nobility. Frederick the Great had a real prejudice against middle class officers, that they lacked the honor of gentlemen. Also, too, von Steuben's behavior in Europe was not exemplary. He was definitely a homosexual, and he had a thing for young men. Now, could have been as bad a handicap in Prussia as was his middle class background and need to adopt the noble von, even though Frederick the Great himself was crashingly gay. Steuben could not get a job anywhere as a middle class homosexual officer, but he came to the United States and he simplified the Prussian drill system for Washington's army. And he did something that worked out very well. He trained the trainers. He taught continental American soldiers how to do the Prussian drill and also how to teach it to others. So Washington's army became a lot more cohesive, a lot more disciplined, and far more effective, as shown at Monmouth, due to the influence of this unemployable German gay guy. Now, on the other hand, Sir Henry Clinton was committed to a lower risk, less aggressive strategy that centered on holding New York. At this point, he wasn't playing to win so much as playing not to lose. But there were still opportunities in order to break the general stalemate, and not necessarily by attacking Washington. When we look at this too, just be aware of the Battle of Monmouth. The Americans were no longer going to be a pushover as they had been in New York 2 years before. That they came out tougher, more effective, and they were able to stand and fight against the British, one of the best armies in Europe, if not, definitely not the biggest. People who say that we took on the greatest empire in the world, I can remind them, no, France was on our side. But the British Army and its German professional hirelings were very, very good, among the best. And the Americans could stand and fight with them. And they demonstrated this on a very hot day in Monmouth, New Jersey in 1778. What Clinton adopted was what was termed the Southern strategy. Instead of fighting in the North against Washington, he was going to break the general stalemate by heading south. He perceived that there were large numbers of loyalists in the South, including in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. He would make this the centerpiece of his late war, what turned out to be a late war campaign. And a lot of these were concentrated around 96, which was a fort in the back country of South Carolina, and also Cross Creek, North Carolina. Now, the Loyalists were defeated at Moores Creek on the 27th of February, 1776. This is near Wilmington, and I've gone past it a bunch of times on my way to see the USS North Carolina. Always wanted to visit, but this was a small battle that, again, took the initiative away from the British allies in the South, to which they never recovered. But Clinton saw an opportunity to help them recover, joined forces with them, and crushed the Patriots. Now, as of 1778, Savannah, Georgia was in British hands, and the French and Americans tried to recover it in September and October 1779 and failed. So they had a critical port to start with in Georgia and in the deep south. So they were not in a really bad position. There were opportunities to exploit that against the American Patriots. Let's look at the early stages of the Southern strategy and the British offensive against the Carolinas. Lieutenant General Clinton sailed south and successfully besieged Charleston, South Carolina, which was defended by General Lincoln, Benjamin Lincoln, whom we see on the right side. He didn't just capture the key city of the Carolinas, but also destroyed the main Patriot army in the South. And this went on from the 29th of March to the 12th of May, 1780. And Lincoln, you see on the right, was not a overwhelmingly martial type of character, you could say, but he was not a bad general. And if he had been allowed to maneuver from Charleston, his options, in fact, were constrained by civil authorities. If he had been able to move from Charleston and maneuver, perhaps his army would have survived. But he had his initiative taken from him by local politicians, and he did not have the operational freedom he really needed to take the offensive against the British, or even just to escape from Charleston. So he was captured, his army was captured. General Lincoln, by the way, was eventually exchanged, but it was still a massive defeat for the Americans. Now, Clinton, as soon as he took Charleston, he went back to New York, which was the centerpiece of his strategy in the North, keep New York City. And he left General Charles Lord Cornwallis to command in the South. I will be talking about Cornwallis a lot later on my channel. I see him as perhaps the best operational commander that the British had in North America at the time. Americans tend to think of him as kind of a loser because of Yorktown. And it's an image that's reinforced by the movie The Patriot. Too many people get all their knowledge of the American Revolution from The Patriot. And they might remember Cornwallis as an old guy that had his dog stolen and then returned by Mel Gibson. It's not quite accurate. He was in his 40s. He was energetic. He was aggressive. On the whole, I think a pretty good general and the best that they had in North America at the time. Now, replacing Lincoln, the Americans sent General Horatio Gates south. He was the purported victor of Saratoga. Guy who won the war basically in the North, had a victory big enough to bring the French in, that they could have more confidence that they were going to back a winner when they allied with the United States in a treaty negotiated by Benjamin Franklin especially. Whether Gates was the chief architect or not is definitely up to question. Most historians will give Benedict Arnold at least equal credit. He was one of the Americans' best field commanders, a great tactician, a fine leader, a man who was wounded several times in the service of his country, but whose reputation has necessarily suffered for the fact that he turned out to be a traitor who attempted to hand West Point over to the British in New York. And his chief intermediary, by the way, was a General Andre, who was his wife's former fiancé. So we're getting in some weird, dishonorable soap opera action at this point. Now, Gates performed badly in the Carolinas. At Camden, South Carolina, he was defeated and chased off the battlefield by Cornwallis on the 16th of August, 1780. No one ran faster from the battlefield than Horatio Gates. And yeah, he saved himself, but he did not save his reputation. It was he made bad decisions that made the made the outcome more probable too. It's not just that Cornwallis won, it's that Gates misunderstood his forces and he put more reliance on the local militia than he should have. They performed as expected by anyone else, which was they didn't, and it was fully consistent with Gates' own performance, and he ran even faster than they did to get away from the battlefield. The Americans didn't give up when Gates was defeated at Camden, and they continued in a regular guerrilla warfare. And as a lot of historians would do, I consider this an American Civil War before the Civil War. That you had Patriots fighting Loyalists, the Patriots being backed by the government in Philadelphia, and the Loyalists being backed by British regulars as well as some German regulars. And I should note too that the Germans were not mercenaries. They did not fight under the British flag in British units with British officers. That they fought under their own officers in their own uniforms and under their own flags. What happened was the British government paid off their employers. They paid off the dukes, electors, the nobles, and minor royalty who had raised these regiments, paid them, and they sent the regiments to America. So don't call them mercenaries. They were professionals. They were very good soldiers, maybe on the brutal side, because that was the military culture in Central Europe at the time. But they were the ones who supported the Loyalists in the South, along with British regulars and British-raised units that were basically Southerners under British officers. So this was a very bitter war, as civil wars tend to be. Now at Kings Mountain, a lot of Patriot militia, the so-called over-the-mountain men, defeated a Tory force under Major James Ferguson, the inventor of the Ferguson rifle. And this was one of the tipping points, that the Loyalists were soundly defeated, Ferguson was killed, and the over-the-mountain men went home. But they had inflicted a bad defeat on the Tories. Now, the Loyalist uprising that Cornwallis and Clinton expected was inhibited by Patriot irregular warfare guerrillas. The Battle of Kings Mountain, and some very bad messaging from the British that was not guaranteed, not even had the possibility of encouraging Loyalist activity, as they put out what they considered an olive branch to Patriots. But they were letting them off the hook, too much for the Loyalists and not enough for the Patriots, so it didn't change any minds. And the uprising that the British wanted never really happened. Now, another decisive event, Washington sent one of his best remaining field generals south. This was Nathanael Greene. And he took over command in the South after the failures of Lincoln and of Horatio Gates. After the surrender of Benjamin Lincoln in Charleston and then the defeat of Horatio Gates at Camden, Washington dispatched General Nathanael Greene south to take over the forces in the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, Greene started off in a way that is very unusual for a fighting general. He was born into the Society of Friends in Rhode Island and was eventually expelled because of his interest in the military and his membership in the militia. The Quakers are consistent pacifists to this day, and he violated that principle on a regular basis. So you could term him a former Quaker. The Quakers certainly did. They expelled him. He was also very capable in logistics, and he demonstrated this at Valley Forge, where he restored supply lines to the army. He coerced and, you could say, extorted local farmers into providing their produce to the Continental Army, and he stopped the starvation, basically. And I give him and Steuben equal credit to a very large extent in the recovery of the Continental Army after the losses of New York and then Philadelphia during the Saratoga campaign. One of Sir William Howe's worst moves was to attack Philadelphia when he should have been heading up the Hudson to aid Burgoyne. Burgoyne surrendered, and Howe went home eventually. But he took Philadelphia, at least temporarily. It was recovered when the French came in. Greene was all through this with Washington, and he kept the Continental Army supplied. He took care of logistics, and there's an old saying that amateurs study strategy and tactics, professionals study logistics. Greene was good at all three of them. And also, too, Steuben helped restore the tactical capabilities of the Continental Army. So I would put these two almost as like twin pillars in supporting Washington, Greene and Steuben, but from different perspectives. He also developed a pretty good strategic sense. He started off badly in 1776 during the latter stages of the New York City campaign. He advocated keeping Fort Washington in present-day Harlem at the end of what is today the George Washington Bridge, and on the other side of the modern bridge, Fort Lee in New Jersey. He advocated keeping them as Washington retreated. It was a grave mistake. Howe was able to overwhelm both. Half the Continental Army's strength wound up rotting as prisoners on prison hulks in New York Harbor, and it was a really stupid decision that Washington made on the advice of Greene. Fortunately, this was the low point of Greene's strategic bad decision making and lack of sense, and he got a lot better as time went on. One of the preludes to Guilford Courthouse, a very important one, was the Battle of Cowpens. This was fought on the 17th of January, 1781, and for logistical and operational reasons, Greene had divided his army in two, and part of it was under the man on the right, the old wagoner, General Daniel Morgan, who had commanded Virginia riflemen, most notably at Saratoga. Very good general, but at this point, he was handicapped by very serious arthritis. This is a man that I think is sort of forgotten for his contributions to the eventual American victory in the war. In large part, it was due to his rheumatism and the fact that after Cowpens, he really had to retire. Physically, he could not do anymore, so he was sort of dealt out of the victory by his own weakened condition. On the other hand, you had the British and the Loyalists, commanded by Ben Astor Tarleton. Now, it's almost inevitable, it's mandatory I have to mention the movie The Patriot again, because the character of evil Colonel Tavington, based on Tarleton, was played by his fellow Liverpudlian guy, Jason Isaacs, and who played it brilliantly. Isaacs is good in everything he did, but he was one of the movie's great villains when he played not Colonel Tarleton. He was known for being ruthless, nasty, and thoroughly dedicated to defeating the Patriots, including by massacring troops at the Battle of the Waxhaws, which gave the gave rise to the term Tarleton's Quarter. In other words, no quarter at all. Somebody surrenders and you still cut them down. Now, here's Morgan's plan on defeating the ever confident and very competent Colonel Tarleton. He would go on the defensive, and Tarleton would attack two lines of militia. The militia would not be expected to stand and fight, as Gates would have done. Morgan knew their capabilities or lack thereof, and they would volley and then run away. They were going to run away anyway, so let them run. Now, Tarleton could be expected to charge, which he did, and he would run into a third line of Continental regulars who would not run. And guess what? It worked. Here we have a map of Cowpens in central South Carolina. The British under Tarleton are on the right side, charging quite confidently against the militia at front. They keep on charging until they run into the Maryland and Delaware Continentals at the top of the hill, supported on the flanks by Virginia militia, who did stand and fight. Now, as Tarleton was mixed up with these guys, the militia in the front lines, they had run away as expected and planned. Dragoons under Colonel William Washington, this is George Washington's cousin, attacked them in the left flank and inflicted a bloody defeat on Tarleton, who, while not as evil as Colonel Tavington in the Patriot, certainly deserved to get a bloody nose. And you can't really feel sorry for the guy for much of anything, but this was his signature defeat. And it showed not to be so overconfident. Now, the prelude to Guilford Courthouse involved the race to the Dan River in southern Virginia. Greene ran away. This is not a runaway like Gates had done. This wasn't a hell-bent for leather bug-out. This was a planned retreat. That he would fall back, have Cornwallis chase him. And he counted on Cornwallis pursuing him, and Cornwallis came through. As he retreated, remember, Greene had a real mastery of logistics and transportation, and what he would do when he got to a river, he would collect all the boats to keep the British from commandeering them, and he would use the boats to cross to the other side, leave the boats there, and keep right on going. Also, too, when he retreats, he's going towards his supply sources in Virginia. Virginia was one of the most productive of the colonies at the time. It also had the second largest population after New York. So when he retreats on Virginia, his supply situation is just going to get better. And the British pursued as best as they could. They were slowed down by their baggage trains, by the need to maintain their own logistics in what was basically hostile territory. Now, Cornwallis' solution to this was to burn his supply wagons, starting with the ones carrying his own personal goods, to set an example. Now, this could make his army move faster, but such essentials as eating became a lot more difficult, because even if they could forage for food, this is in February, March, there's not a lot of food left. Whatever farmers had stockpiled, they're going to be running low on, and they haven't started. They haven't even really started sowing their fields yet, let alone harvesting them. Fall would be a good time to forage for food. Late winter, early spring, really bad time. And Greene, the consummate logistician, was able to achieve logistical superiority over the British. They exchanged their logistics for speed, much to Greene's satisfaction. This is one case that I really think that the Patriots totally outfoxed the British. And in Cornwallis's favor, I don't think he had much of an option. That in order to catch Greene, he had to increase his mobility. And when he got desperate, he took desperate means. But the Battle of Guilford Courthouse took place on the 15th of March, 1781. And this was in an area in the interior of North Carolina. Today, it's north of I-40, just north of the city of Greensboro. You've probably, if you've ever driven across North Carolina, you've driven nearby. It's not really out of the way place, although I do rely on OnStar to help me get there. And this is an area populated at the time largely by the Society of Friends, the same people from whom General Greene had emerged in Rhode Island. And he was not on the best terms with these guys because after the battle they had care of the wounded inflicted on them, much against their will. But this is not also to remember with the Quakers. They were basically anti-slavery, so you're not going to have the huge plantations full of enslaved black people in their parts of North Carolina that you would, say, in the Tidewater region. This is not the North Carolina of all your stereotypes based on the Civil War. Greensboro and places further west were populated in large part by Germans, by Quakers, by people who had come down the Great Valley from central Pennsylvania, from Lancaster County, through Maryland, and then the Shenandoah Valley into North Carolina. So economically, socially, it had more of a northern cast to it than you would think of with the South, especially later on. And later on, it did become very Southern in good ways and bad ways. Greensboro went on to be the site of pro-civil rights sit-ins that were reacted with violence and hostility. But during the American Revolution, things were a little different. Also, too, while the Cowpens battlefield was fairly wooded, Guilford Courthouse was much more wooded. The forest has largely grown back, and in fact, I would say that the woods now are more extensive than they were in 1781. This is not an open field. This is the forest. There's less visibility, and hence a lot greater chance for confusion. Hiding behind trees might have sounded very good tactically, but unit cohesion broke down, command and control broke down, and troops could become very confused fighting in the woods. This is a wooded area punctuated by fields. Now here's what Greene decided to do. He was going to follow a plan very similar to Morgan's at Cowpens. It worked once, let's try it again. He would put the least reliable troops, his North Carolina militia, out front. The second line would be the Virginia militia. And the third line would be those dependable Maryland and Delaware Continental regulars. And the Marylanders were among the best in the Continental Army. And it was almost identical really to Cowpens. But the field had a lot more trees. On the right side here, we see in the green jacket, Colonel Tarleton, not Colonel Tavington, Tarleton. Both guys were from Liverpool, but this is the actual Colonel Tarleton, an important figure before and during the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The battle begins around 10 o'clock. The British were tired, they were hungry, and they made contact with the Americans, the Patriots, at 10 o'clock. Tarleton led the vanguard, which consisted of much of what should have been the British reserve. This was the first problem, that Cornwallis started losing his reserves as soon as the battle started. Now, the British force consisted of a mixed bag: the Guards Light Infantry, German Jaegers, and Tarleton's own British Legion Cavalry. These were the guys out front. And you could say that these were all elites. The British Legion under Tarleton had performed reasonably well. In fact, I would say very well outside of Cowpens, and that was his mistake, not theirs. The Guards units, these were composite battalions drawn from the Guards regiments in London. And British Guards can always be considered an elite until proven otherwise. And they were, I would consider the Guards in Cornwallis's army to be his very best troops. The German Jaegers were rifle-armed light infantry, very good soldiers. And so this was an elite in the vanguard of Cornwallis's army under Tarleton. Now, they did run into the militia first, the guys from North Carolina. Now, they were commanded to fire 2 volleys in retreat. They were not supposed to be a barrier. They were more like a speed bump, that they would delay and disrupt the enemy and then take off. They were going to take off anyway, so work this into the battle plan. They volleyed at least once. Both sides did. Now, most probably, they didn't get off that second volley as Greene had ordered them to, but the militia got off one, and then they ran away to the north. Now, the British suffered significant, but at present hard to determine casualties, yet the cohesion remained intact, which is important. The vanguard held together, but still they took losses from the North Carolina militia before they took off. Now we have Cornwallis here on the right, as you see, not the old dude with the stolen dogs that we see from the Patriot. Sorry, Mel Gibson. And what he was faced after these first volleys were diversions on his flanks. On his left, the 33rd Regiment of Foot was flanked by Virginia riflemen who drew the British away from the main force. They went charging off after the riflemen and were no longer in the main attack. On the right, the 1st Guards and the Germans under von Bosse went after Henry Light Horse Harry Lee's dragoons. Again, a distraction. And Light Horse Harry, by the way, he was the father of Robert E. Lee. So another family connection to the later Second Civil War, if you will. But he drew off significant forces on the British right. And the British Army started to split in the center as these 2 flanks diverged from the main axis of attack. Cornwallis felt compelled to commit more units from his reserves, the 2nd Guards and the Guards Grenadiers, to shore up that hole in the center as it developed. And this severely weakened his force because he committed his reserves early, and it was basically to take care of a problem rather than to exploit success. The troops on either flank went off on sideshows, which could have been inevitable, and it reduces the chances of a worthwhile British victory, all in what one might even say should have been a walkover. The British moved forward and they collided with the 2nd line of American militia. These were the Virginians. They were positioned in thick woods, and there were 2 brigades of them. Now, maybe because they were outflanked, Robert Lawson's brigade fought just as badly as the North Carolinians. 1 volley and then they're gone. Now, Edward Stevens' brigade fought more stubbornly, and they managed to neutralize the 71st Foot and the Scottish Highlanders as offensive forces. Stevens retreated in good order. He didn't run away as Lawson's Virginians and the North Carolina militia did. So I would say that Stevens outperformed, and so did his troops. And they may have done more than they were actually expected to. So here we have the confusion of war and no battle plan surviving contact with the enemy, as Helmut von Moltke the Elder would say. And one brigade outperformed expectations and the other certainly underperformed. But that's just the way life works. Then the British came to the third American line, the one with the Continental Regulars. James Webster's brigade advanced, but was shattered by Patriot volleys at about 30 yards. Webster was mortally wounded. The 33rd Foot's charge was repulsed. The regiment fell back to high ground where it made an effective stand. It was able to go on to defense and not be destroyed. The 2nd Guards routed the raw soldiers of the 2nd Maryland, and they took 2 Patriot artillery pieces in the process. So the Maryland line was considered very good, but this was a fairly green unit. And they did get routed by some of the best soldiers in the British Army. I think they might have been expected to stand a little better, but when they were routed, it wasn't by a third team force, it was by the best of the British Army. Now, William Washington and his dragoons and the North Carolina and Virginia cavalry counterattacked the Guards. And while the over-enthusiasm of the Guards got them in trouble, the 1st Maryland Continentals flanked them and threw them into utter confusion. So the Guards' initial victory over the 2nd Maryland Continentals didn't really work out for the long term. There's one question that I think really holds over the battle, and this is whether the British ended it by firing on their own troops. It's taken almost as a matter of faith that yes, they did, and it shows how ruthless Cornwallis was. But I think we have to take this into question. The prevailing story is that he orders his artillery to fire into this melee and did not care about casualties among his own soldiers. Like I said, it's open to question. Now, no less an authority than General Greene says that he did. He told the Guards Commander Charles O'Hara that it was a necessary evil. Now, Greene was in no position to know because he's on the other side of the battle. Now, neither Cornwallis nor O'Hara mentioned this conversation, and Cornwallis does not talk about it in a letter to General Lord Francis Rawdon. If it came up, you think one of them would have said something. Also, O'Hara was wounded twice in this melee, and he might have even been captured for a short time. And he was definitely not in a position to talk to Cornwallis about much of anything. So I'm not sure that Cornwallis really did this. That it's a myth that has arisen. Now, as always, I invite you to do your own reading and research, but my vote is never happened. Maps. I love maps. And anytime you have material on a battle, you should have a map. Here's the one that I found for Guilford Courthouse, where you see the British are actually attacking from the west-southwest towards the Patriots in the east-northeast. Most of the battlefield is heavily wooded. You do have some farms, but they are few and far between. And it's mainly in pretty thick woods. And this would help explain the confusion on the flanks early on, because battles that take place in forests have an extra vulnerability to confusion. And I think it certainly happened here. And also, too, battles are confusing just in any event. But if you'd like, feel free to freeze it here and look at the map, consult it, and consider everything else in this presentation to see where things have happened. And I'll add, too, that I've been over most of this battlefield, everything that is in National Park Service hands. And it looks pretty much as it did then, only with actually more woods. But you get a good feel of it. And the really significant areas they're on the drivable tour, and you can get a good view beyond the map of what happened there. So if you can't go to Guilford Courthouse National Battlefield especially, or National Military Park, read more, look up more maps. In the meantime, feel free to pause on this one. This is the end of the battle. Now, the British could say they officially won it as the Americans retreated. They held the field. This is the traditional measure of who won the battle, who's on the battlefield and who isn't. The British are on the battlefield. Now, Greene had the foresight, though, to designate a post-battle rally point at the Speedwell Iron Works, about 30 miles to his rear. So he didn't have to struggle really hard to try to recover his troops afterward. He knew where they were supposed to go. They knew where they were supposed to go, so he could reform and recover a lot better than he would have if he had just improvised. This is an example of extremely good planning on Nathanael Greene's part. Now, according to one source, written by Lawrence Babbitts and Joshua B. Howard in 2009, the British lost 93 killed, 413 wounded, and 26 missing, out of a force of 1,900 to 2,200 men. They put American losses at 79 killed, 184 wounded, and 1,046 missing, out of 4,000 to 4,400 engaged. Consider, too, that a lot of the Patriot losses are going to be in the militia. Really, the weak sisters of the Army. Not a lot was expected of them. And outside of one brigade, the Virginia militia, not a lot was actually delivered. These are not the best troops. And I don't want to say no big loss, but it could have been a lot worse. On the British side, a lot of their losses were in the Guards. They were in regulars. They were in very good troops. And also some of the leaders. And Tarleton, for his part, was severely wounded in the hand, and he lost several fingers. So he fought most of the battle with a really nasty wound. Now, as a postscript, when he went back to Britain, he became something of a compulsive gambler. And the lost fingers on his hand did not really impede his ability to play cards. But it was definitely a nagging wound and could not have done him any good during the battle. So, despite winning the battle, Cornwallis had to retreat to Wilmington to regroup and resupply, more than 30 miles away, in fact, a couple hundred. And Greene did not have to. He still had his back to his supply sources in Virginia, but Cornwallis was out of food. He was out of every sort of supply, so he had to go back to British-held Wilmington, North Carolina, to regroup and resupply. He had really no choice in this. Now, Greene, after he recovered, he went south to engage with Rawdon in South Carolina. So he exploited his victory in North Carolina by going to South Carolina and taking the war to the British there. Cornwallis's next move was to invade Virginia. He wanted the supply sources. He wanted to cut off support for Greene in the Carolinas, and it seemed logical to him. This resulted in breakdown of relations with Clinton in New York City and Lord George Germain in London. Germain is one of those figures that the colonial secretary, I don't have a whole lot of respect for. He never should have been in the job. First of all, he was court-martialed for cowardice and insubordination to the Duke of Brunswick during the 7 Years' War. So you have a guy with that black mark on his record. He shouldn't really be in charge of anything. He was also roundly disliked by most of the establishment because he was kind of effeminate, and he was most certainly gay, but not in the manly gay way that Frederick the Great and Friedrich von Steuben were, but he was not respected by his peers. And in a battle between the two gay guys on both sides, I would say that our gay guy was better. Germain was not a good colonial secretary, and he was the real mastermind of the war, and therefore the defeat is on him. Now, Cornwallis's move into Virginia really, really scuppered relations both with Germain and with Clinton. And I think there was a lot of jealousy, too, between Clinton and Cornwallis. And of the two, I would say Cornwallis was actually the better commander. Now, this invasion ended up leading to the Yorktown campaign and the grand British defeat. But I really don't blame Yorktown so much on Cornwallis. I think that invading Virginia was actually halfway logical. And when he backed himself into a corner at Yorktown, Yorktown was actually picked for him by Clinton as an anchorage that could accommodate the entire Royal Navy, their entire commitment to North America. That Cornwallis preferred City Point, which in a later war would be the main logistical center and supply point for Ulysses S. Grant, the Army of the Potomac, during the Petersburg-Richmond campaign. But Yorktown was not Cornwallis's first choice. And also, too, I really feel that he was let down by the Royal Navy. You're a British general. You should be able to count on the greatest navy that ever sailed to have your back. And they let him down, and that resulted in his surrender to Washington and Rochambeau. And as a little bit of irony here, Cornwallis refused to attend the surrender at Yorktown. He pled he was sick. So he sent O'Hara out. O'Hara had recovered from his wounds by then to do the surrender, and Washington refused to accept it. He turned matters over to the exchanged General Benjamin Lincoln. So that was Lincoln and Washington's payback for Charleston. But you could argue that Guilford Courthouse led directly to Yorktown, that it set Cornwallis up, and then he was let down by Clinton in New York, who was planning actually on coming and reinforcing him, but the French Navy showed up and cut Cornwallis off before this could happen. Cornwallis, by the way, came out of it with his reputation fairly intact, and he went on to bigger and better things that I will probably deal with in a later presentation. But Greene actually, he never won a battle. He was the Americans' best field commander outside of Washington at the end, and he won basically by losing. He lost Guilford Courthouse. He lost Eutaw Springs in South Carolina against Rawdon, but he could win the campaign. And it shows that if you can inflict a Pyrrhic victory on the enemy, you can end up with a strategic victory for yourself. And this was where I think that Greene's value really lay. And the foundation of that was his mastery of logistics and his mastery of strategy, his ability to, I'll say, copy um, Morgan's battle plan. That he didn't go and reinvent the wheel when the old Wagoner's wheel worked just perfectly fine. And he, at Guilford Courthouse, he was able to make the most of it. And here we have the denouement of the Southern campaign with the French surrendering at Yorktown. You see Washington at the head of the American troops on the right, and you see the French under Rochambeau on the left, with the British surrendering to Lincoln in the middle. And I know there are going to be a lot of jokes about this. I don't tell jokes about French surrender after visiting Verdun. That's enough to inoculate one against all those jokes. But if you notice, the French battle flag is a white one. That's not a sign of surrender. That is not a flag of truce. That is the Bourbon royal banner. So that is a flag that the French army justifiably waved with pride, not with surrender. But this is the real climax of the American Revolution in a military sense. It would go on for a bit longer, but after Yorktown, the British were beaten and they knew it, and would eventually make peace with the Americans and the French with the Treaty of Paris. For the war gamers out there have been games on Guilford Courthouse. Decision games included it in a couple of boxes that included major battles from the Southern campaign. It's okay. Then there was the Guilford Courthouse scenario from Carolina Rebels, which I developed. That has not aged as well as it should have or could have. As I understand it, many of the copies were consigned to a Viking funeral when Lock and Load Publications changed ownership. So Carolina Rebels really didn't go on to spawn anything else besides maybe some memories. But there is one game I can recommend, and wargamers should not be surprised. It's Guilford from GMT's Battles of the American Revolution series by Mark Miklos. And I have it both in the standalone box, which I've covered in the print edition of Line of Departure, and it's also included in the first Revolutionary War Battles tri-pack that GMT put out, with the characteristically excellent artwork by the late lamented Roger Bean McGowan. I think this is the standard in the class of the category for Guilford Courthouse games, and it's my favorite system covering the American Revolution. So Guilford Courthouse, Guilford, with the bonus battle of Eutaw Springs in South Carolina. That's one that I can heartily recommend. It has the Line of Departure endorsement. Now, there are a lot of sources on the battle. I mentioned Babbitt's and Howard earlier. Their book, Long, Obstinate, and Bloody, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is an academic work published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2009. This is very standard. This is one that if you're interested in the battle, you have to read. It's mandatory. I would say that Stanley Carpenter's Southern Gambit, Cornwallis and the British March to Yorktown, is an outstanding strategic perspective on the battle and the campaigns. There's also the Correspondence of Charles, first Marquis Cornwallis. I believe I found this on archive.org, which is a totally excellent resource for works in the public domain. So you have a primary source in Cornwallis's own words. Likewise, we have Nathanael Greene's memoirs, Memoirs of Life and Campaigns of the Honorable General Greene from 1819. Light Horse Henry Lee, he wrote his memoirs of memoirs of the war in the Southern Department of the United States in 1812. Robert Middlecoff's The Glorious Cause, the American Revolution is from Oxford University Press as part of their series on the history of the United States, and is therefore a very good single volume book on the American Revolution. Algie Newland's book, The Battle of New Garden, Greene's, which is another word for Guilford Courthouse battlefield. This was published by the North Carolina Friends Historical Society. And this is one that was recommended to me by the staff at the battlefield. And it addresses the whole Quaker viewpoint towards the battle and towards their former member, Nathanael Greene. It's kind of arcane, but if you can find it, read it. There's a good book on Ben Astor Tarleton by Anthony Scotti, Brutal Virtue. Patriot Battles, how the War of Independence was fought, is one that was actually, much of it was assigned when I took a graduate course in generalship in the American Revolution. Now, this was good for me because I already had the book and had read it. And this doesn't just look at the tactics and the battles and the campaigns. It also looks at the recruitment and what sorts of men joined the Continental Army. And much to the surprise of people who might buy into myths, Stevenson's contention is that they joined for the same reason that Europeans joined their armies, largely because they needed a job. And it was less out of idealism than it was out of a lack of a social safety net. And sometimes it was the only place where somebody could get a job, or they saw a chance to advance, or they were just attracted to the military life. But he really downplays the idea of patriotic idealism. So these are some of the best sources, some of the more, I think, definitive ones out of a whole lot of sources that you can find. And I definitely invite you all to do your own research here and find stuff that maybe I failed to mention. I did write a graduate paper myself on this, on the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. It is as yet unpublished. It was in the hands of a war game magazine. I'm not sure what they're going to do with it, but if they don't, it will wind up on the Line of Departure online features site. So yeah, this is where I did a lot of my research years and years ago. And it was for a graduate class on generalship in the American Revolution. By the way, taught by a guy who was a former Secret Service agent, former Green Beret, but earned his PhD from the University of Exeter in England. So much of his perspective was based on the British, not the American side, but even though he was a patriotic American. So that was a really good, fresh look at our revolution. So this concludes my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, please like the presentation. If you do, put a like on it. Please subscribe and share with your friends. Pass it along. I want to have an audience of more than one this time if I can possibly do it. So thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope it's been fun. It's been for me. This is a favorite topic of mine, and stay tuned for more. And as I said, don't keep it to yourselves. Tell others, and please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.